cannot locate it on any map or find it mentioned in any books about travel. There are no signs or other navigation tools to help one know where it is located. In fact, the people who live there may not know its name. But there is a state called Melancholy. There are no festivals in Melancholy, for it is not a festive place. The customary sights and sounds of tourism will not be found in Melancholy. People who live there do not invite others to visit. People who do not live in Melancholy hope they never get lost there, and certainly don't want to go there on purpose. Tourism is not practiced in Melancholy because Melancholy does not appeal to anyone as a place for sightseeing, vacationing, exploring, or leisure. Although there are no maps to Melancholy, no signs about Melancholy, and no references to Melancholy in books about travel, Melancholy does exist. Melancholy is not a virtual place. People actually live in Melancholy. People work in Melancholy. People don't want to live and work in Melancholy, but Melancholy is a hard place to leave once you get there. Melancholy sort of grows on you like moss grows on a tree, to the point that eventually it is hard to separate oneself from Melancholy. It becomes hard to know where one ends and Melancholy begins. And it's especially hard to find a way out of Melancholy. Just as there are no directional aids to help one locate Melancholy, there are no signs that point the way out. There are no signs that read, "You are entering Melancholy." No signs that read, "Thank you for visiting Melancholy. Come back soon." No signs that read, "Exit in Melancholy." How do people leave a place no one can find? How can people help those who must live in that place escape when they don't want to go there themselves? How do people survive life in Melancholy? And where do people in Melancholy find hope? The book of Lamentations in the Hebrew Testament is about melancholy. It is about the physical, the emotional, the moral, the social, the political, the cultural, the commercial, the religious gloom, depression that descended on and dominated the lives of people after the kingdom of Judah was conquered by the Babylonians in 786 BCE. Most of the people were forced to travel to leave the only place they knew called home. Some fled to Egypt. The majority were sent to Babylon. They were not in Babylon as visitors, as tourists. They were driven, they were forced, they were moved, relocated, uprooted, transplanted, put out of Judah, and jerked, hauled, forced to go to Babylon. But whether people escaped to Egypt or were sent to Babylon, the effect was the same. They were not in Judah. They were not home. Although the place had the name on the sign called Babylon, they weren't really there. They were in melancholy. The Babylonians deported those who were considered leading figures in Judah to Babylon, where they were forced to learn a new language and eat food they weren't accustomed to tasting and seeing and smelling, and experience customs and practices unknown and forbidden in Judah. That's how life goes in melancholy. I think about that because that is the experience of the people who were moved from southeastern United States and hauled across the Trail of Tears. I think about that because that's the experience of people who were taken from the shores of Africa and stacked like sardines in ships and hauled across the Atlantic and then dumped in a place where they did not know what the words were that were coming out of the people's mouths, because the words were made from sounds they had not heard before. They saw trees that did not look like anything they'd seen before. They smelled sounds that did not smell like anything they'd smelled before. They were not home. They were in melancholy. That's how life goes in melancholy. The same was true for the small group of people who stayed in Judah. For the small group of people the Babylonians allowed to remain where they thought was home, although they stayed in Judah, Judah wasn't the same place after the Babylonians conquered it. So even though they hadn't left Judah, Judah had become melancholy because all of the familiar sights and sounds were gone. The landmarks were gone. The temple was gone. The neighbors were gone. The friends were gone. Think of what your neighborhood would look like if all the folks in your neighborhood weren't there. When the people who sing the songs at your birthday parties are no longer there. When the people who visit you at the holidays are no longer there. When the people you call on when you need something are no longer there. Even when you are there, you are no longer home. You're in melancholy. Lamentations is a deep and a hard look at faith in the state called melancholy. The passages we read force us to admit that melancholy is a hard place. Melancholy is a hard place for anyone. It is a hard place for everyone. There are no comfortable places in melancholy. And it's hard to hold on to faith when you live in melancholy. Melancholy is a faith-choking, faith-starving, faith-suffocating, faith-blinding, faith-deafening, and faith-numbing place. It seems like hope is impossible to find in melancholy. On the other hand, the sight and the sound and the smell and the taste and the feel of gloom is everywhere in melancholy. Melancholy is the place where people in the Bahamas and Puerto Rico live now, because the sight and the sound and the stench of death and despair are their constant companions. If you have not lived around death, if you have not had to live around the smell of death, you don't know what it's like. But if you've ever lived around the smell of death, if you've ever lived around the smell of decaying corpses, and you realize you cannot leave, and you realize nobody will come get you, you have no perfume that can make the smell go away. This is what life is like for people in the Bahamas now. Every minute, every hour, every day, every week. It's called melancholy. It's what life is like for people in Puerto Rico who did not get relieved, recovered, rescued. And they still have tarps over their roofs because although they're living in the richest part of the hemisphere, the richest neighbor in the hemisphere doesn't want to drop any help in melancholy. You understand, when you live in melancholy, even your neighbors won't help you. Melancholy is like that. It's like that song that Cindy played at the prelude, "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child" is the melancholy of children of asylum seekers who were taken from their mamas and daddy's arms and placed in pens, and some of them don't even have enough age to know how to talk, let alone to have anybody to talk to that will care about how they feel. They cannot say mama. They're just living in melancholy. Melancholy is the place where their mamas and daddies are. They cannot find their children. They cannot find anybody who will help them find their children. They cannot find anybody who will listen to them about needing to find their children. They cannot even find anybody who will give them any mercy about their children. Melancholy is a hell of a place to live. People in prisons and jails across the world live in melancholy. It's the sound of the gates on the prison. It's the sound of the locks on the door. It's the sound of the guards. It's the sound of the sirens. Melancholy has sounds that nobody else hears because nobody else wants to be close around to hear them. And only the people who live there, like people in prisons, people in jails, know what melancholy sounds like. People with addiction and other diseases they can't get out of live in melancholy. May live with the reality that comes with not being able to get better and not be able to stop getting worse. So do people who live in relationships that are abusive or self-destructive or that seem to offer no other way out that makes sense. People in the Little Rock School District live in melancholy. People who live where toxic chemicals have poisoned the air and the water and the soil and the food and are producing clusters of sickness that nobody else wants to talk about and everybody else wants to pretend aren't happening are living in melancholy. people who are unwealthy and are being uprooted and dislocated by wealthy people due to something called gentrification live in melancholy. It's a melancholy place that you're leaving, and it's a melancholy place that you're going to, and melancholy is all the thing you're traveling through. You're going from melancholy to melancholy by way of melancholy. Undocumented workers trying to avoid being deported back to places where their lives were threatened by war and disease and calamities and poverty and other forms of violence are living in melancholy. Can you find melancholy? Anybody know anything about melancholy? Melancholy is a gloomy and painful place, even when people who live there try to be brave and joyful. It's painful to admit that melancholy is where we are. And it's especially painful when we've lived in melancholy so long that melancholy becomes who we are. Melancholy not only is where we are, we become melancholy. We have a name for that. It's called depression. And when we finally realize that melancholy is home, when we finally realize that this is where we are then forced to try to retrace how we got there. How in the world did we end up in this relationship? How in the world did we end up in this sickness? How in the world did we end up in this jail or this prison? How in the world did we end up with this administration? How in the world did we end up with this debt or this outfit or this? You fill in the blank. And then the worst question, why? Why the hell am I in melancholy? I mean, take all of the sweet sugar stuff off of it and just admit it. Why in the hell am I in melancholy? How do I get here? And why the hell am I here? Can't figure out why nobody come to get me out of melancholy. Can't figure out how come nobody visits me in melancholy. Whoever wrote Lamentations was dealing with all this. And the authors, whoever wrote Melancholy, some folks like to say it was Jeremiah, but we really don't know. And there's really some good evidence to suggest it wasn't Jeremiah. Just like folks like to think that David wrote all the Psalms. He didn't. Or that Solomon wrote all the Proverbs. He didn't. But we like to hang familiar names on stuff. And so folks like to hang Jeremiah's names on Lamentations, but we really don't know who wrote Lamentations. But whoever wrote Lamentations, documented, detailed the gloomy realities of melancholy on the people that were living there. The kingdom of Judah, and with its capital Jerusalem, was no longer a proud and a hopeful place. And so notice the documentation, notice the details that we get in this passage. How lonely sits the city that once was full of people. How like a widow she has become. She that was great among the nations. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, that she has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. they have become her enemies. In other words, the countries we thought were going to help us have turned on us. Her foes have become the masters. Her enemies prosper because the Lord has made her suffer for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone away captives before the foe. And then at verse 19 and 20, in the third chapter of Lamentations, the thought of my affliction and my homelessness is wormwood and gall. It's nasty to my taste. It's bitter. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. Melancholy feels bad. Melancholy tastes bad. Melancholy hurts. It is painful to document the details of life in melancholy, but that's another feature of being there. In melancholy, it's much easier to find signs of loss and grief and failure than it is to find signs of hope. Hope dies quickly and often in melancholy. Grief and loss seem to have the fertility of rabbits and the tenacity of cockroaches. So where do people in melancholy find hope? How can people in melancholy break free? Get loose, escape, somehow be delivered from melancholy? That's the big question. I mean, that's the big question. And the answer is provided in the last part of the passage that Chiquita led us in reading. But this I call to mind at verse 21 of the third chapter, and therefore I have that wonderful four-letter word, hope. And here it is. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Somehow the authors of Lamentation write about hope even still in melancholy. Despite the daily grind and sorrow of life and melancholy, the authors manage to hope by remembering, hope by remembering, hope by remembering. I want to say that again, hope by remembering. Memory is an important thing because memory not only allows us to remember pain, it allows us to remember when we didn't have pain. If you can remember you had pain, you can also remember when there was life BP, before pain. Okay? Yeah. There's life WP with pain, but there's also life BP, before pain. And oftentimes in melancholy, you are still with so much life WP with pain that it is hard to remember life BP, before pain, before the bills, before the sickness, before the diagnosis, before that low-down, shiftless, mean, hateful somebody, before those nasty folk, before the hateful stuff, before the... You fill in the blanks. Before the government that won't listen to you, lies to you, cheats on you, dogs you, and then dares you to praise it. Somehow the authors write about hope, even still. Despite the constant and the pervasive presence of oppression and gloom and melancholy, the authors of Lamentations call to mind, that's the word, call to mind, remember. They call to mind, they make themselves remember that God's mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. They are new every morning. In other words, they remind themselves. You see how new every morning shows up twice? Because you understand, we have to remind ourselves. Sometimes I have to be my own medicine. When you don't have anybody else to bring you medicine. I used to wonder how come the old folks would just walk around humming. When I was a child, I used to wonder how come the old folks just walk around humming. You know, nobody making any music. And I don't wonder, what's wrong with them old people? They walk around humming. When you don't have any music going around and everything you have is melancholy, the only way you can get a sound that is not melancholy is to make your own music. And now you know why the blues came out. Now you understand the spirituals. Now you understand sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Now you understand the blues, including the blues about somebody, she done me wrong. He done me wrong. Oh, when you can't afford to buy you a record, you have to make your own record. You have to make your own music. And so the authors of Lamentations I call to mind, and they say, God's mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. They are new every morning. And the message from the authors of Lamentations is that God's love cannot be kept out of melancholy. Although nobody wants to go to melancholy. And the folks in melancholy can't figure out how to get out. Melancholy can't keep God out. The mercies of God for asylum-seeking migrants will not be kept out of melancholy by Donald Trump's wall or by Donald Trump's ways. The mercies of God will find a way to deliver children and parents in the melancholy known as the Little Rock School District. They can't keep God's ways out. There is still a deliverance. The state board can't keep God out. The mercies of God will find a way because God is faithful. The mercies of God will find a way because God doesn't give up on us even when we mess around and work our way into melancholy. Whether we run into melancholy, stagger into melancholy, get hauled into melancholy, back into melancholy, drink our way into melancholy, eat our way into melancholy, cheat our way into melancholy, love our way into melancholy, or however we get into melancholy, God's mercies still find us. Even when we mess around and wind up in melancholy. The mercies of God will find a way because the merchants and the tyrants and the other oppressors who rule melancholy, and don't fool yourself, melancholy always has some folks in charge. There's always somebody in charge in melancholy. The folks in charge in melancholy are no match for God's goodness. The government of melancholy is no match for the government of God. They are no match for God's obsession to deliver us. The powers of melancholy are no match for the power of God. The fierceness and the foolishness of melancholy is no match for the faithfulness of God. And even when we in melancholy has lost hope, God's hope finds a way to find us. That's what I like about God. God doesn't depend on me to hope in order for God to hope. Hello? You understand? I can get up for hope. I can give out hope. I can get sick and tired of being sick and tired and stop thinking about anything except being sick and tired. And all I think about is being sick and tired. I don't think about hope anymore. Matter of fact, I'm sick of you talking about hope. But that doesn't stop God from messing around and busting in on me. Great is thy faithfulness, morning by morning. New mercies, fresh mercies, born mercies in the place of melancholy where everything is dying. God is birthing mercies. In the cemetery called melancholy, God is opening a delivery room called hope. Even when we've lost hope, God finds a way. God's faithfulness finds a way to keep working even when our faith has been shattered by life and melancholy. God's goodness is everlasting. It is ever acting. It is ever scheming. It is ever mindful. It's ever working to make what the elders of my childhood called a way out of no way. That's what they knew. The way out of no way was called melancholy. Melancholy was a no way place, and if you need a way out of no way, you need somebody who knows how to get out of no way. Who knows the way to get to no way when there are no signs of no way, and the way to get you out of no way when the locks on the gates on no way. Morning by morning. New mercies. New mercies. Day by day. Minute by minute, situation by situation, and even in the state called melancholy. When life in melancholy becomes gloomy, God's love produces goodness. When life in melancholy produces sorrow, God's love promises new mercies. When life in melancholy brings you fake friends and fierce foes, God's goodness promises great faithfulness. The goodness of God cannot be kept out of melancholy to comfort us, and the faithfulness of God doesn't mind busting into melancholy to deliver us. God is bad enough to bust into melancholy, to bogart God's way into melancholy. The psalmist expressed this idea very well in a psalm we sing. We don't give the psalmist credit, we just sing it and don't think about it. Which is why I'm glad we sing the hymns, because it reminds us to know what we sing, because usually in the hymns they'll have a little text, a little scripture, at the top. So, and oftentimes we don't want to read the hymn book, we just sing something. But if you read the text, you see them. If you go to African American Heritage Hymn, and I tell you this hymn, you will find this psalm, Psalm 27:1. I don't know what Psalm 27:1. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. I don't know what it is. Yes, you do. Yes. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Number 160 in the African American Heritage Hymn. I love the second stanza of that psalm because it reminds me of the troubles of life in the state of melancholy are no match for God's goodness and God's mercies and God's faithfulness. You recall the second verse? In the time of trouble, melancholy, he shall hide me. In the time of trouble, he shall hide me. In the time of trouble, he shall hide me. Then the question, whom shall I fear? Whom shall I fear? Whom shall I fear? Whom shall I fear? The Lord is my strength, the strength of my life. Whom shall I fear? And in melancholy, when I get there, I hear some say, hallelujah, hallelujah.